Uh, Today we're ready to finish up the stage of adolescence. We left off, we were talking about the parent-teen relationship, and we'll move through the rest of this fairly quickly. We just want to highlight some of the characteristics of some of those patterns. We left off, we last time had talked about parenting styles. Anyone recall which of the three styles is most effective for the stage of adolescence? Authoritative. Excellent. And again, be sure that you kind of continue to review those three different styles. But we talked about the authoritative style and some of the reasons why that style is probably most effective during this stage. Again, as we kind of look at the following kind of characteristics of parent-teen relationships, remember that we're looking at kind of broad generalities, and there are obviously individual family differences. And also I think it's important to keep in mind that the vast majority of families really negotiate this stage very well. And the vast majority actually have, in spite of some of the changes and some of the challenges that are taking place, have relatively good relationships. And often the focus, as we mentioned the other day, tends to be on the small percentage, which is probably 25% or less, that really have a breakdown of relationships, a breakdown of communication, and more of what we think of as this all-out rebellion. And that really represents a fairly small, a significant percentage, but it's clearly not the majority. So the last point here is the degree of influence parents have over their adolescents is strongly influenced by how well they get along. You know, if somebody were to ask me, what's really the key of parenting teenagers? And the key really is to done a good job from day one building a good, strong, solid relationship. And if you build a good, healthy relationship from the earlier stages, and you have a good relationship going into the adolescent stage, it's probably not going to be overly traumatic. There'll be issues to deal with and challenges to deal with, but the reality is you don't have as much control and power as you really think that you might have, and that the influence that you have, the strong influence to influence the adolescent's behavior and choices and decision, is really based on having a good relationship. And if you have a good relationship with them, a lot of times they're going to be pretty cooperative. And part of that stems, which we said I think the other day, stems from the fact that teenagers who really respect their parents and have a good relationship with their parents don't want to disappoint them, for the most part. Doesn't mean you won't have issues, but your real influence, your real power is in the quality of that relationship more than anything that you can do to them or take away from them. And that's where the influence really is. Again, I don't know whether this necessarily was your experience, and again, it is related to the quality of the relationship between parent and adolescent, is that adolescents want their parents to like them and to approve of them and to accept them in spite of faults and mistakes. Again, we already talked about that they do want more freedom. They want more independence. They want to make more choices and decisions in their lives. And I think at some level they know that when they do have more freedom, when they are making more decisions and choices, that they're going to probably make some bad ones. But in some ways, part of what they want freedom for, again, in those places that's not life-threatening or high risk, is they do want to have the opportunity to make those choices and decisions, and in some cases to make mistakes. And still know that even if they do make a bad decision, they do make a bad choice, that their parents are still going to accept them. Not necessarily their choice, not necessarily always their behavior, but them as a person. And that they really do want their parents' acceptance, approval, and affection. Now, it depends on what day you ask either one, whether you ask the adolescent or the parents, but the majority of adolescents report positive feelings towards their parents most of the time. Now, it does depend upon what day it is and what's going on. But again, the operative key here is most of the time, not all of the time. Now, if you ask them on a day when they've been denied something they wanted or they've had a momentary conflict over an issue, then their feelings towards parents may be different. But again, it's a myth or a notion that conflict is occurring all of the time. Now, we all probably know some family where it appears to be more often the case. But again, I don't think that's the majority. Again, I don't know if this was your experience, but even though they spend less time with family, relationships do improve as the teen moves through this stage of development. In other words, the majority of the conflict tends to be, again, dependent upon the nature of the relationship and how parents negotiate this transition of this stage. Most of the conflict does tend to be more during the early years and tends to be less conflict, and the relationship does tend to improve as the adolescent moves into the later years, particularly by the time they're a junior, senior in high school. And shortly after they've graduated and in some cases moved on to their next decisions, be that a job, college, whatever it might be. Why do you think there tends to be more conflict in early adolescence? And again, if it was your experience, why do you think that relationship improved as you got to the later stages of adolescence? Because most talk about by the time they were junior or senior, a lot of the conflict, a lot of the fighting really had been pretty much put behind, and talks about much closer relations with their parents during that phase. Any thoughts about why it would improve? And again, it may not have been your experience. But if it was, why do you think it was better in the later stages than the early stages? I think clearly some of it is that, in the maturing process, simply becoming more mature and handling situations better. Any other thoughts? Yeah.
Parents will kind of adjust to the child growing up, because I'm sure that's really hard.
Yeah. And I think that's a big part of it is that, those early stages is really an adjustment to the reality that their child is growing up and that they're soon to be emerging onto young adulthood. And I think a growing acceptance of that and a growing realization that I've got to allow them more and more increasing independence. And then hopefully with the increasing maturity as they move towards that junior and senior kind of stage of life, that the choices and decisions they're making are better. On a relatively good choices in decisions. Any other thoughts about why that relationship would improve as we kind of move through this stage? I think some of it is, as we talked about this earlier in terms of that relationship expanding, I think some of it is the fact that the relationship does expand. And as that teenager is getting older and moving closer and closer to young adulthood, I think there's a tendency for parents to look at that youth, almost a young adult, differently. And to start to relate, again, as we talked about before, on somewhat of a less authority over someone and more on relating person to person, based on more mutuality, trust, hopefully mutually effective communication between the two, rather than me as a parent and having authority over you. And hopefully one of the things that happens is that control becomes less of an issue. And when control becomes less of an issue, relationships tend to improve. Again, I don't know if you ever uttered these words in some form or another to your parents or not, but the major complaint of adolescents is that their parents treat them like kids and that they don't trust them. And again, some of this simply stands, from the point that, a lot of times parents still see them as children, and they are their kids and forever will always be. And it goes back to a point that you made earlier, is that some parents really struggle with the notion of their teenager, of their child growing up and getting older. And so I think some of it is a real challenge for some parents to allow them to really grow up and look at them differently. To some extent, where it says that adolescents complain about their parents trusting them, to some extent there's probably some truth to that. And that would be why. I think parents want to, and sometimes I'm not so sure that it's necessarily that they don't trust them. Yeah, sometimes it may simply be what they don't trust are all the other influences. And sometimes it's hard. I trust you, but I'm not always confident that you will have the internal ability to withstand a lot of the other social pressures, be that, peers, The statements from the media and society that may be influencing choices and decisions you make. And I may really believe you're a good kid, you have the best of intentions, but I'm not always sure that I trust everything else that surrounds your world that I can't control. And I think a lot of times parents, understandably, are scared. Are scared that teenagers will make some bad choices and decisions, and that will be harmful to them be that physically or emotionally in some way, and are wanting to protect. At the same time, I think again the complaint is, at some point you got to turn loose. You got to trust that I'm going to do the right thing. You got to believe that I'm going to be able to do the right thing. And at some point in time, parents and teens have to come to terms with that critical issue. We already mentioned this one. Parent-child conflict increases in early adolescence and tend to decrease in later years. And we've already talked about the reasons, or at least some of the possible reasons for that. Again, as we said earlier, that most of the conflict centers around the issue of control. And it is during early adolescence where there tends to be that major kind of push. And again, during early adolescence, the youth is still young and still relatively immature, and still lacking in experience sometimes to make certain choices and decisions. And so out of a desire and a need to protect, parents tend to be somewhat more restrictive, struggling sometimes to find that balance. And so we do see more conflict at that moment when they begin to exert that independence. And then I think over time both begin to kind of work that out and find a healthy balance. Again, I don't know in your situation or your experience, but mothers seem to bear most of the conflict except when fathers are present. And again, like I said, I don't know whether this was necessarily your experience or not. Can you think of, even if it wasn't, can you think of some reasons why that tends to be the case? It clearly was in my household. There was no doubt about it. My mother was at least somewhere in the middle of most of the conflict that took place. Mm-hmm. That was my mom. I mean, she was very overprotective. And I wouldn't say overly, but she was very involved. She wanted to know what was going on. She was really interested. And being honest, I wasn't offering much at that stage of life. And I think in my household, and again, I don't know what your experience was, is that my mother was the one that was around when most of the conflict took place. A lot of the conflict in my household centered around me and siblings. And she was kind of always in the attempt to kind of referee that. My mother was the one that we often went to ask or get permission for something. And so if there was a difference of opinion, that often occurred between mother and us in some kind of form. And I don't know that we had as much outright fighting. A lot of times when people think of conflict, they think of outright fighting. I think there was just a lot of differences of opinion, about things. And again, I don't know about in your household. I shared this in one of my other classes, but I can still hear those words uttered so vividly in my mind, is when my mother finally had gotten fed up with the conflict and the arguing or the fussing. All my mother had to do was utter 4 words. That was not the 4 words in my household, but that would probably work in many.
That was mine this weekend.
That was yours this weekend. Go to your room. Anyone? Yeah, in my household, my mother would say, well, you now wait till your dad gets home. And that's all it took. And then it was, he will take care of this. And then the conflict ended almost immediately. No more arguing, no more fussing. Then we went to our room, kind of thing. And so my dad never really dealt with much conflict because we stopped. And we stopped because we didn't want my dad to be involved in the conflict, and so we would get really good. We'd behave, act right. Dad would come home, and Mother would do what? It worked almost every time. She will have forgotten about it. And so she didn't tell Dad until the next day, same pattern, same scenario, all over again, and we just kept cycling around. And you wouldn't believe it. Dad walked in that door, angels, kinds of things. Didn't do a whole lot of arguing there. And again, not true in all patterns, but I think it does. And a lot of it's just simply as often mothers are the ones who are much more involved in the role of parenting, and so they catch a lot more of the conflict. All right, ready to shift gears. We're now going to kind of hit a stage where most of you, if not all of you, are kind of living right now, and that's to begin to take a look at young adulthood in that particular stage. I think with a lot of the stages in terms of adolescence, I think it's sometimes still difficult. I mean, we tend to think of young adulthood, and we often will, if we're going to throw out ages, we used to typically throw out that period between 20 and 40. The upper end is getting more difficult to define, and can you think of, there's one major reason why. You know, a lot of people would think that after 40 you're still a young adult. You know, if you were to ask my child, 30 would be old. What's determining the upper end of young adult more difficult? Yeah, nothing more. People are living longer. You know, we'll talk about middle adulthood later on, but we tend to think of middle adulthood kind of as that medium point. And as people live longer, we actually are beginning to kind of extend. And I think now we tend to think of young adulthood up to 40, and then with kind of a transition stage, and they're transitioning from young adult, you know, towards middle adulthood. So for our purposes, we're kind of thinking of that period between 20 and 40. But the upper end gets harder and harder, I think, to really define. The beginning, I think, gets harder to define as well. We often think of young adulthood, technically being that period of time when a person really is independent, you know, socially, financially, emotionally to a certain extent. And for some, that truly is by the age of 20. Others, it may be somewhat later than that. But that's kind of the period that we're referring to. I'm going to just put these up as a group. We're not going to spend a lot of time because we're going to really address them as we kind of move through our discussion. We've been talking about developmental tasks. And I think this is a stage that for most, it's pretty easy, I think, to remember and to identify the developmental tasks of young adulthood. We're going to talk more specifically later on about several of these. But it is the stage, and it is some point in time during young adulthood when the majority will select a mate and will get married or move into some type of committed relationship. It may not be formal marriage, it may be cohabitation, but will form some type of committed relationship with the intent of that relationship having some longevity to it. Then after selecting a mate, another developmental task is simply learning to make marital adjustment or relationship adjustment and learning to live with that person. For the majority of those couples, they will, again, during this stage, will start and make that transition into parenthood and begin starting a family and begin raising children. Later on, when we get to social development, and also kind of as a part of emotional development, we will look at very broad overview, some issues around early marriages, some of the issues that are related to forming and maintaining those relationships over time. We'll also spend a little bit of time talking about that transition into parenthood, because those tend to mark two critical periods of young adulthood. And they're both critical periods that will have tremendous impact on the young adult's satisfaction in life. So again, selecting a mate, making that adjustment to living with that partner successfully, starting a family, raising children, managing the home. Again, all of those are tied around those critical choices and decisions. Also, which we won't spend a lot of time in here focusing on, but another major task is it is the stage when most individuals will have completed their education or their training and will start their careers. And then finally, for many, will begin to assume certain civic responsibilities. And a lot of that will be some of the places in which they get involved in their community, in providing leadership in their community, or at least involved in community-related activities. Can you think of just a couple of examples of what that might relate to or apply to? Where would be some places where the young adult, and some of you may already be involved in some of that right now in your life? What would be some examples?
Serving on a school board.
Definitely serving on a school board. And a lot of times we tend to think of, but it's not always the case, we tend to think of older adults, but, more and more we're seeing more and more young adults, finding seats on school boards. Excellent. What else? A couple other examples. Exactly, being a scout leader and being involved again in those type of community organizations. A couple other quick examples.
More younger politicians now running for office than
And even some of the surrounding communities. You're exactly right. Again, more and more young adults. Early 20s. Vying for political offices in their communities. I don't remember where it was I saw in the paper just the other day. There were, 2 or 3? It was in Springfield. 5 of them that were all under the age of 30, I believe. 35? Again, still within that young adult. But there were some, I think, that were in late 20s or something in there. Yeah, that's true. We have I guess the youngest governor. So again, we're seeing more and more young adults again involved in political offices. More and more young adults involved in, again, local community organizations like Rotary or Chamber of Commerce. And not only being involved, but taking key leadership, roles. And I've been surprised at how many, again, those that I've seen even in our own community, 21 and 22, very involved in those kinds of activities. For some, it could be in organizations like churches. And again, taking leadership roles in those organizations where up to this point they may have only been more participants in that. So, again, some of the critical developmental tasks. Now, one of the things, and we won't spend a lot of time with this, but I find it just kind of interesting. Young adults today kind of fall into the category of what we refer to as Generation X. I am the previous generation. I am a part of the baby boomer generation. Most of you in this room's parents are probably somewhere in that baby boomer generation. What we want to do, and again, we won't spend a lot of time with this, but I'm fascinated by differences in generations and kind of how changes have taken place, from one generation to the next. And so, ironically, in my situation, though I am a baby boomer, my child will actually have skipped a generation, and he will actually be a part of following generations, rather than in many cases, I'm probably very similar age to many of your parents, yet I have a child that's 13, so I'm a little out of whack there in terms of stages a little bit. Can you think of any examples? Then we'll just highlight just a few real quickly. Can you think of any examples of how your generation, or how, and some of you may not necessarily be a part of Generation X, but I imagine that most of you probably are, or at least some of you are. But the generation under the baby boomers, how do you think that generation is different from the baby boomers? Can you think of anything that's different? And we'll see that on here. Clearly, one of the big differences. And again, it's interesting that if you compare Generation X with baby boomers and then the previous generation, that's even more the case. If you look at, which is really kind of ironic, I look at my mother, and she has been involved here recently in taking several computer classes. She finally broke down, got her a computer, and then all of a sudden realized what? Really struggled big time. Didn't know how to use it. Was frustrated just in terms of turning it on. She was hooked up to the internet, couldn't figure out how to do anything with it. Even had trouble at times even figuring out how to work email. And so now she's actually taking some computer classes and trying to figure out. Whereas Generation X, is been so oriented to technology. My son still, laughs at me, and I'm a whole lot more technology literate than I used to be, and was very hesitant to get more and more involved, and is constantly joking about how he's got to come show me how to hook things up. And the reality is, a lot of times he does. And and I thought we had bought a camcorder not too long ago, and it was nothing for him to figure out how to hook it up and use it. And I was thinking, I'm going to have to teach him how, and that wasn't the case at all. I mean, it just comes pretty natural to him. A couple other things, and then we'll look at this list. Can you think of other examples of differences that you might see between Generation X and baby boomers?
education.
In terms of?
Continuing
level of education, then that's probably true, and I think that's continued. The demand for more education and more training continues to increase, I think. Good. Anything else you can think of? Without a doubt, clearly, and I don't know that that's necessarily on this list per se, but clearly changes in gender roles. And they're continually to evolve, but, and again, if you look at even previous generations, dramatically different. And I think this generation is still kind of defining that. And probably more than anything else, discovering that there's not probably a set norm as much as there used to be. Anything else that comes to mind before we look at the list? And we'll see if any of these tend to hold true. And again, you may not necessarily agree with all these. I don't know. But what we tend to find, at least in terms of surveys that have been done, is that Generation X tends to be more accepting of other points of view. Now, what you got to remember is that when we look at a generation, we're looking at a 20, 25-year span. So there's a lot of variation between those that are on one end of it compared to those who would be 20, 25 years older on the other end. And they may be more similar in some ways to the preceding generation. And then you've got those, someplace, in between. But what we do tend to find, I think, generally speaking, is Generation X, in a lot of ways tends to be somewhat more open-minded, more accepting of varying views, and becoming increasingly more accepting of diversity. And again, may not always be the case. As we've already mentioned, they are very comfortable with technology. And clearly much more so than older baby boomers, maybe not as much as younger baby boomers who maybe by necessity have had to become more familiar with technological changes. This one may be somewhat of a surprise, and it may be confusing. Generation X are more conservative than early or young adults in the previous generation. Now, this is one of those that you kind of have to understand what the statement is saying, and then it may make more sense. It's talking about young adults now are more conservative than the previous young adults, the previous generation when they were young adults. Meaning what? When was the baby boomers young adults? And that may make somewhat more sense.
In the 70s?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a vast majority of them would be in the late 60s, early 70s, a high percentage. So what you got to keep in mind is that when you're looking at this current generation of young adults, what you're doing is you're comparing them to the baby boomers when they were young adults in the 70s, which basically means what? When they were young adults, they tended to be a little bit... Very. Yeah, I mean, that was a period of time when a lot of change was initiated, and a lot of movements took place, again, in the late 60s and the early 70s. And if you think of it as a pendulum, it was clearly a generation that swung the pendulum way out here. Now, the reality is, as they moved from young adulthood into middle adulthood, and now some are starting to approach late adulthood, what happened to that pendulum? It really has swung back for many of them. They're not near as liberal or near as radical as they probably were at the point of young adulthood. But they're still probably much more liberal than young adults are today. The pendulum has kind of swung back to being somewhat more conservative in a lot of ways. Now this one, again, may seem a little bit surprising, maybe not. But the current group of young adults actually face more financial challenges than the previous generation. And the baby boomers financially are much better off than their parents' generation. Now, any thoughts about what that means and why might that be true? Credit cards, again, clearly we're seeing more and more young adults in terms of really struggling in terms of financial debt. And some of that in order to live up to their wants and needs and expectations. Any other thoughts? Student loans. And what it's taking to get, what it's costing to get an education. And again, as you mentioned earlier, the advanced schooling taking more years. What What's the other thing that many young adults are finding even after they get the education?
You can't find a job.
It's amazing how many, again, have been told, get a college education, and I believe it, you need it in order to find a good job, and then how many graduate and then find they can't find a job or a good job in their chosen fields. And how many, and I bet you know someone who's graduated and all of a sudden they find themselves at least initially or momentarily working a job that they didn't need what? A degree for. And trying to make sense out of that. I was told I needed a college degree, and all of a sudden here I am finding myself doing something that I could have done without it. Now, in most cases that's a transition, but many are finding when they get out that the type of job that they were hoping, or the job that they're wanting in order to maintain the lifestyle that they desire. That's part of the challenge. I think it's interesting if you go to my parents' generation, there's always been a desire on the part of parents in terms of their children, and that's always been what? In terms of life. And I can say it as a parent. What they wanted to be able to provide for their children. Just in general. I think every generation has always been wanted to say that I want to make sure that life is easier and better than it was for me. If you were to talk to my dad, he would talk to you and tell you about, which is true. He dropped out of high school, went into the military, got out of the military, got a job, went to night school, and got his college degree, and did that without a high school diploma. He kind of did it the hard way, and he would tell you about the struggles that his mom and dad had, and that life was better for him and his siblings than it was for his parents. And one of the reasons why he worked so hard was that he wanted life to be easier for his children. And there's no question, that our life and lifestyle was much easier than his was, growing up. But I think what we're finding is it's becoming harder and harder for families, for parents to be able to guarantee that for their children, because I think there are increasing uncertainties about the job market, the economy, the future. And at what point, can we continue to increase lifestyles, incomes, lifestyles that people, desire and aspire to. And I think what a lot of young adults are finding that's harder today than maybe they thought it would be. And again, as was mentioned earlier, more and more young adults are finding themselves, with extremely high financial debt in the attempt to live that lifestyle that they want. So again, much more financial challenges. And who knows what will happen in the next 10 years. I think what we find from Generation X is that they're less confident of their jobs, incomes, and relationships. Can you think within society some of the trends, and maybe trends is not the right word, but can you think of some of the things that have happened in society that we've seen a lot in the last 10, 15 years that would cause young adults today to be less confident about careers and jobs and relationships? Clearly, one of the big ones is divorce rate. And a lot of young adults, they still, I think, have the same goal, the same aspiration. They want to be married. They want those to be successful. But at the same time, many talk about their doubts about whether that really is possible, realistic, because more and more have seen, again, from the late 60s, but particularly the 70s, up through the 90s, a drastic increase in divorce. And many have lived the impact of divorce within their own families, And one of the things that we know statistically is that, again, those that have experienced that within their own families are at a greater risk of that occurring within their own relationships for a lot of different reasons. What about in terms of jobs? Why might you have some uncertainties or hesitations about the future in terms of job markets? Can you think of anything that you've kind of, not necessarily personally impacted, but have seen happen within society in terms of jobs? Seen a lot of it in the last decade.
There's so many of the companies that have gone bankrupt or moved to Japan or Mexico.
Yeah, we've seen, and again, major companies that we would have never have imagined that would happen to. What's one industry right now that we've seen a lot of news coverage on that's really struggling big time? Airlines. Yeah, and of course I still try to figure out how can you go bankrupt 2 or 3 times and still be in the air. but they are, but clearly, large corporations that we would have never thought would have been threatened by bankruptcies have experienced bankruptcies. And even within our own region, think about the companies that we've seen fold and move out. I think it's interesting. I see it in the community I live in right now in terms of a lot of what's happening to small towns. And again, not a good or bad, but one of the things, we have a super center being built right now. And I've watched, I walk in my community a lot, and I walk from my house to downtown, and you would be amazed at how many of the storefronts in downtown are empty and becoming increasingly empty, and I know how many businesses right now really are worried about what's going to happen to their livelihood. And again, I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but when the super center comes in, will it still be able to support 2 other grocery stores? And what about some of the hardware stores and some of those businesses? But we've seen in all of our communities, businesses closed, jobs lost. One of the things that we've seen happen for a man, and I don't know, someone in here may have a parent that this happened to, but the experience of parents who have lost a job that they had been in for many years because the company was doing what they refer to as either outsourcing or also, downsizing, restructuring. And part of what they've been doing is finding that they can save money by, in some cases, hiring younger people, for lower salaries. And in some cases, getting people who have more education, and at least more book knowledge. And so we've seen lots of changes. You go to my dad's generation, it was really common that you worked for a company, and in my dad's situation, worked for the same company, 30-some plus years. Now, what was interesting is he had his job for 30-some years, but the company had to have changed at least 4 times the name of the company. But still, but his position, and even though it shifted and changed, still remained relatively unstable. That's not always the case today. So people aren't always as confident in jobs and relationships as they've been one time before. And this one, I think, is, generally speaking, very true. Relationships between Generation X and baby boomers' parents is better than between baby boomers and their parents. We clearly have seen some drastic changes, again, in parenting styles, parenting attitudes. Some of that, I think, is because of what we know about parenting, some about what occurred as a result of some of the transition and changes, that took place in the 70s and 80s. But again, when you look at it, again, for many of you who are probably, if not Generation X, close to it, probably have considerably closer relationships more than with your parents than your parents had with their parents. And again, it's not a statement that those were bad, only that they have changed. And I think we're going to continue to see that to be the case. Clearly I think I have a much more positive, much more emotionally close relationship with my son than I had with my parents. And I have a good relationship with my parents, but it is clearly different. We're much more connected. We spend a lot more time together, and we're much more affectionate as a family than we saw in our previous generations. All right. So anyway, just some differences as we look from one generation to the next. As we prepare to kind of take a look at emotional, or as we begin to look at physical development, we want to look at a theme that will carry over through every stage. And what we want to do is to look at practices that are related to health. And we're going to see these themes emerge not only with young adulthood, but will emerge when we get to middle adulthood, later adulthood, and as we talk about quality of life. And what we find, and I think this is interesting, is that health at age 30 will predict health at age 70. Now, why would that be? Exactly. But one of the things that happens is at age 30, what don't you often realize? And I can speak from personal experience. For most young adults, I think you may know it at one level. Well, you definitely start to show some declines during this stage. But for the most part, at least in early young adulthood, what do you tend to believe in terms of your health, your physical health? You'll always have it. And in a moment when we start to look at physical development, one of the things that we will realize is that you are in your prime. But what you tend to believe is that you will stay that way no matter what. What we find is, and the reality is, and it goes back to exactly what you were saying, is the lifestyle that you develop now at this stage in your life will often set the patterns, unless you drastically do something different, that you will carry on into the following stages of your life. Now, what's interesting is that most young adults today are very much aware. There's no surprises on here. The 6 issues related to healthy lifestyle. You know what they are. But being aware of them, concerned about them, does not necessarily guarantee what? That you'll act on them. Exactly. And we'll see that, I think, as we begin to take a look at some of the issues around physical development and health during young adulthood. So, what I want us to do, and you don't have to say anything out loud, but what I want you to do is to do your own self-evaluation. Now, there's no surprises on here. But as a young adult today, I want you to think about your lifestyle and your patterns. And would you consider them to fall into the category of healthy? Because what's interesting is the patterns that you establish at this stage, in many cases, will continue into the following stages. And when we get to the later stages of life and we begin to look at some of the physical challenges, what we're going to find is that many of those physical challenges didn't begin in later adulthood or middle adulthood, but they actually were the result of patterns that were established much earlier in life. This is probably a very crude analogy, but I think it's very much a true one. You buy a brand new car. Now, what's your hope for that brand new car? What do you believe about that new car?
That it looks that way forever.
That it's going to look, and I don't know how many of you have bought a brand new car. I've bought several. And every time I buy that brand new car, I swear that I am going to take care of this. I can't even begin to admit how many times I've got a car that I guess now is 2 years old, and I'm ashamed to admit how many times I've even washed it. It's one hand, literally. I could count on one hand in 2 years how many times I've washed it. But we say it's always going to look the way that it is. We're going to wash it, and we're going to wax it, and we're going to keep it clean. What else do we believe about that brand new car? It's going to keep working just as it does, no matter what. No matter what you do to it. And that we're going to drive it forever. And it's always going to perform like it did when we drove it off the lot. Now, what is the reality about how that car will look and how it will drive down the road several years from now? What is it dependent upon? And we know. And it is true. How well you take care of it. One of the things that we know is that if you just do the basic maintenance, if you take care of it, you do the routines you're supposed to do. If I were to wash and wax the car, the finish would look a lot better than my car does. If we simply take care of it from day one, it will last and perform a lot longer. And we know that if you change that oil regularly, that engine's going to last a lot longer. But let's say you drive that car off, and let's say you don't change that oil for 20,000 miles. Eventually you won't. But will you notice it after 5,000 miles? No, you probably won't even notice it after 10,000 miles. You may.
Actually, nowadays they're saying not to change it.
As often.
I bought a new Honda and they said I couldn't change the oil until 7,500 miles.
Yeah, they have changed it, but at some point you would need to change it, just not as often. But it would take a long time before you actually would begin to see and gradually the negative effect of never changing the oil. But at some point in time it would catch up with you. And eventually, as someone said, you would eventually, if you never changed it, would no longer have an engine. It would eventually catch up with you. And our lives are somewhat like that. In terms of the lifestyle that we choose to live, particularly at this stage on, will have a tremendous impact in terms of the quality of our life down the road. If we take care of it, if we live a healthy lifestyle, we take care of our bodies, then it's going to perform a lot better down the road. I am keenly mindful today of this lesson. Back when I was a young adult, I played sports. Played sports up through adolescence, played it through young adult. And at some period of time in my life, I had injured my knee. And I had knee surgery. It was back before they had the orthoscopic knee surgery, and I had kind of the full incision and had the cartilage removed, not a particularly big deal. And And then so after I had my knee surgery, and I did do some protective measures. I did wear a brace when I played basketball and stuff, but I would continue to twist it and hurt it. But what didn't I do? And some will say, well, that's just a male thing, and probably to some extent it's true. Any guesses about what I didn't do? Often probably didn't take a break or let it heal all the way. And the one thing I sure never did was never went to the doctor. I would just kind of wait, and I can tell you it was the same pattern all the time. My knee would swell up, and I would wait, and eventually the swelling would go down, and it would get back to the point where it would work fairly well. So I never did any follow-ups, never went to the doctor. And then gradually over time, as I moved through young adulthood, what began to happen to my knee? Well, it gave out on me more often, and I actually got to a period of time when my knee would lock up. But I learned what to do. I know exactly right now where to put my fingers, and I can release it locking up, and I can free it. Finally, I got to a point I was playing, I probably was now starting to approach middle adulthood or coming out of the end of late adulthood, and was playing in a men's basketball league. And then after one particular game, it locked up, and it wouldn't unlock. So finally, I was forced to go to the doctor. And the doctor said, and basically told me, you have what's referred to as an arthritic degenerative knee, which basically means what? In simple terms. Anyone know? It's not going to get any better. You got it exactly right. And so basically, my knee had gotten to the point where I was getting really close to bone rubbing on bone. I mean, that's basically what it comes down to. And the doctor basically said, now, I was still relatively young at this point. And he said, there's only two things you can do. Anyone know what the options were? Surgery was one. And that was one of the options, but I was very, very young. And he said, if we do surgery right now, what's that guarantee you? Arthritis, unfortunately, I already got it. Another surgery before I hit late adulthood. And he says, if you want, we can do it now, but you'll have it done again. Or, if you don't want surgery, stop playing sports. And that's exactly what it was. And all you're going to do is delay the outcome. And today, with the rain and the cold weather, I am vividly mindful of my knee because it kills me. And it's funny, when the weather started to turn off, I had not had any difficulty for any period of time. And when the weather turned off cold, it just started aching. And today, with this kind of chilly, rainy, it's not really chilly, but this rainy weather, it aches. But what I'm reminded of is that if I had done a better job of taking care of it when I was younger, I may not have experienced the consequences of literally changing the opportunities and the activities of things that I could do. And I know that at some point in time, and it's probably getting closer and closer as each year goes by, that I'll have to have knee surgery on it. So it's a lot about the choices we make and how we take care of ourselves. What we'll do at the beginning of our next session is take a look at these 6 factors. We'll do a little self-evaluation of your healthy lifestyle, and then we'll look at some aspects of physical development.